Education is what's important. Training, preparation for the expected. Education, preparation for the unexpected.
Good evening, Team Krulak community. And on behalf of Marine Corps University, the Marine Corps University Foundation, and the Brute Krulak Center for Innovation and Future Warfare, welcome back to the Brutecast, our series designed to connect the worlds of the warfighter and PME with the best in innovative and creative thought. I'm your host, Major Ian Brown, Operations Officer at the Krulak Center. Before we begin, please remember that all the opinions expressed here are those of the individual and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Krulak Center, Marine Corps University, the United States Marine Corps, or any other agency of the U.S. government. All right, so for anyone paying attention to current events, the information domain has been front and center. In this Brutecast, our guests will describe what the Marine Corps is doing about it. We're very excited to welcome the commanding officers of two different Marine Expeditionary Force information groups, or MIGs. Col Brian Russell, commanding officer of II MIG, and Col Lester Gerber, commanding officer of III MIG, will discuss what their organizations are doing in the information space, their commonalities, and some of the unique approaches that each is taking in its respective area of operations. Col Ray Gerber is the commanding officer of the III MEF information group out at III MEF in Okinawa, Japan. A career intelligence officer, he previously commanded the Marine Corps Embassy Security Group Region 2, Near East and South Asia. He served as an intelligence officer at the battalion, regimental, and Marine Expeditionary Unit levels, in combat operations ashore in Iraq and Afghanistan, in direct support of Operation ODYSSEY DAWN in Libya, as well as other contingencies. His previous assignment was providing direct intelligence support to the Commandant of the Marine Corps after his graduation from the Marine Corps War College. And we also have Col Brian Russell here today, who's the commanding officer of the 2nd MEF Information Group out at II MEF in Camp Lejeune, North Carolina. A career artillery officer, Col Russell previously commanded the 1st Air Naval Gunfire Liaison Company, or Anglico, and completed combat tours in both Iraq and Afghanistan. In his previous assignment, he served as the J5 of Joint Task Force Ares and as the Fires and Effects Director of U.S. Cybercom following graduation from the College of Information and Cyberspace top-level school program. He's a member of the Marine Corps Gazette editorial panel and a frequent contributor. And his last article, The 5 OIE Truths, was published in the April 2021 edition. You can also follow him on Twitter at OIE Colonel, COL. All right, gentlemen, good evening or good morning. And thank you both for first of all, for being here, for taking time out of your days to do this, as well as your patience in getting everybody online. So what we're going to do is we have a bunch of discussion points that we're going to just kind of jump right into. And so to sort of lead things off, gentlemen, if you want to first tell our audience, what is the MIG and where did it come from?
So Ian, thanks for the intros, and thanks to you and the Krulak Center for putting this together. As Brian and I discussed how to get through this, you asked the question up front, what is the MIG? Just because we might have a varied audience, thought it was worthwhile to level set that the MEF Information Group, as you alluded to in the bios, is a colonel-level command, works directly for the Marine Expeditionary Force, meaning directly for that 3-star commander. As most know, but just for the sake of level setting, MEFs have major subordinate commands that are led by general officers, like the Marine Division or the Marine Air Wing, and major subordinate elements led by colonels. The MIG or sister MSE, the MU or MUs, depending on what coast you're on, are the primary MSEs at the MEF level. Brian, I know you wanted to dive into the MIC-RIP that talks a little bit more about this.
Yeah, I sure do, Ray. And Ian, also thank you for the opportunity to speak. I think one of the challenges for this session will be keeping within the time limits, because Col Gerber and I do this quite frequently, actually. We do the tandem talk about what the MIGs are doing, the practitioner level of OIE or information warfare or all domain effects. We'll talk about that, I'm sure, throughout this cast. But I want to tell a bit of a story. I'm a former MHG guy. You mentioned I was the commanding officer of 1st Anglico, and my boss at the time, Colonel James Herrera, the CEO of the MHG, talked a lot about operationalizing the MHG because he understood that vision of the capabilities in terms of supporting all the warfighting functions of the MEF are pretty powerful when they're all working together, but he usually got derailed. The first time the MEF CG wanted to set up and fight his COC, that consumed his time. And so one of the major changes when the MIGs were created was establishing one of those subordinate battalions, the MEF Support Battalion, to fight the MEF COC, fight that command element, either them or the MEB. And as we transitioned to the MIG, we retained a lot of the traditional capabilities, communications battalion, to run the comms for the CG or other MAGTFs, Intel Battalion, all source Intel capabilities, both from an analytic and a team capability we can push out. Radio Battalion, our signals intelligence and electronic warfare capabilities, and as mentioned, Air Naval Gunfire Liaison Company. And we can talk more about that. That's usually one of the questions I get is why is Anglico in the MEF information group? And I've got a pretty good answer for that. But in creation, a couple other capabilities came to life upon stand-up. Comstrat Company, the artist formerly known as Public Affairs and Combat Camera, combined into a company here working inside the MIG. Psychological Operations Company, a defensive cyber operations company, and then really one of the major structure changes for us was structure at the MIG headquarters level, an information command center. That is what Colonel Gerber and I use to command and control our forces, as well as do that coordination of warfighting function capabilities in support of the MEF command elements or the other supported force. So that's an overview of those capabilities we bring to the fight. And I think, Ray, you want to talk a little bit about what I talked about. We all understood the power of the MIG, all these things working together, and that's we've got pretty good lineage there.
We do. So, Ian, do you want to dive into the background of how we got to where we got to?
Yeah, definitely, sir. I think how you got there, what it is that you're executing, and then I'm not sure if that was in the agenda for later, but I certainly have a question about what is Anglico doing in the MIG, because I've traditionally that's I look at that sort of as a fires thing and not necessarily an information aspect, but I'm sure it's in there for a reason. So sir, if you want to go ahead with that.
Yeah, so I'll answer that first question directly. So we like to talk about the capital L in Anglico first and foremost, the liaison capacity. Right now, 5th Anglico, the one that is assigned to III Marine Expeditionary Force, is persistently partnered with a couple of key partners and allies throughout the region. Japan being the one that leaps to mind that's the easiest to talk about in this environment. They also have habitual relationships with a variety of other partners, like the Koreans, for example. They're reorganizing themselves into Second Anglico, I believe, is nigh on the same as this, into all domain effects teams. One of the things that's happened is we pushed capabilities down, either organic to the Anglico now, like my psychological operations detachment has now become a brigade platoon within Anglico, to give that commander the ability to generate more effects. Likewise, they can also draw from the rest of the MIG with a variety of other enablers to better do what they're doing on behalf of both the MIG and the MEF commander. I think this is an important segue, and it was something that I wanted to make sure we covered in this. Brian's already talked about the lineage back to the MHG, and a lot of discussion happens about what's the difference between the MHG and the MIG. He highlights that the main difference is the commanding and controlling of forces. We frequently tie ours back even further to the Surveillance Reconnaissance Intelligence Group, the brainchild of the 29th Commandant, Al Gray, who came up with that concept that it basically died on the vine. And there's a variety of reasons for the why behind that. But one of the major points was it also couldn't really command and control. And so it had the ability to man, train, and equip forces for somebody else to use, but wasn't necessarily actively employing them as a unit of action. The only other thing I'd like to throw out with this is to tie it back even further. For us, our prehistory is a MIG. Our official lineage goes back to 3rd Shrig, but we like to go all the way back to 1964 when then Major Al Gray took Marine Detachment Advisory Team 1 into Vietnam as the first ground combat troops that went into Vietnam, based around a SIGINT entity, but it also had security, fires, and the capability to sustain itself. In many ways, that's a pre-MIG-like activity, highlighting that we've been doing this for a long time. We just haven't been doing it at this echelon and at this scale with a unit that's purpose-built for it. Final thought, he said, what do we do? Brian and I talk about this a lot. The easiest way for me to describe what I do is I close kill chains. We sense, we make sense, and we facilitate action. Increasingly, that action is agnostic to whether it's lethal or non-lethal, kinetic or non-kinetic effects. Brian, I'll pause there and let you jump in, brother.
Yeah, I'll go back to Anglico and come back to where you just left us. That is lineage as well. Anglico was birthed out of our World War II experience. And the creation of them was to enable, if you think about it, cross-domain operations. How do we integrate fires from the water to the land, employing the air domain in support of that? And so very small teams facilitating cross-domain operations, and the inherent nature of Anglico from that sense in addition to the liaison capability they bring that Ray talks about, is any MAGTF capability to allies and partners or a supported force. So our all-domain effects team construct is essentially task organizing additional MIG capabilities with those all-domain effects teams. It can be PSYOPs, it can be Comstrat, it can be electronic warfare, it can be cyber, it can be a whole host of capabilities down at the very small tactical level in support of another force, either adjacent or within the MAGTF. And really, really powerful bringing those things together. To that point, you know, what does the MIG do? We can, this is where we'll get into terminology. The mission statement says, I help the MEF commander conduct operations in the information environment. I know Colonel Gerber and I have found some difficulty in how to translate that to our supported commanders, typically maneuver type of commanders. I know my CG right now is thinking in terms of 21st century combined arms. We are just enabling 21st century combined arms, and all the recent public debate about force design and where we're going. I would say we've got a lineage of thinking in a combined arms fashion, and we just have different means to sense the environment and then to shoot at that environment with a different capability. There's some other things we can talk to in terms of what the MIG does as it relates to the terminology and the doctrine. I could say I help my MEF CG establish information advantage. I think there's probably many in the audience that have seen early versions of MCDP 8 information, and the three pillars of information advantage being systems overmatch, prevailing narrative, and force resiliency. And I know Colonel Gerber and I talk a lot about where we are both inclined as we start to discuss what the differences between the MEFs are and the MIGs are. I very much think Colonel Gerber leans into the systems overmatch realm a lot based on his location and the adversary he counters, where me as a service retained force ready for about anything, focus a little more on prevailing narrative and force resiliency type of thing. So we could phrase it that way. I help the MEF commander establish information advantage. And I saw all the chat about OA truce, and I know Ray loves all my OA truce, but to that point that everybody fights, yeah, everyone's got a piece of this information environment. So just for my own Marines inside the MIG, when, hey, what does the MIG do? I just tell people, even down to the individual level, we help collect, protect, and then project information. Again, for the MEF commander or whatever the supported force is.
So Ian and Brian, I do want to, so Brian and I have a great dialogue about this, and it's transforming what's happening right now within the service, I think, to a degree. One thing that I think we also have to acknowledge is the mission statement talks about information, but the MIG has to do all 7 warfighting functions. And so we have capabilities to do all 7 resident within the MIG, and in order to support the MEF, the MEB, or whoever we're designated, often we end up doing things other than information. And so sometimes I think that gets lost in the noise on the race to talk about just information, despite it being a primary object inside of our actual title. Over.
So that's good, sir. Yeah, and I think to our audience, we do have a talking point here where we're going to go into some more sort of misconceptions about the MIG, what it does and doesn't do. But as you're listening to us, if you have more questions about what you might think the MIG does and looking for some clarity on it, it'd be a great thing to ask here. But to sort of jump off, and Colonel Russell, something you'd mentioned in there, it's specifically talking about the 21st century combined arms and force design, right? As well as both you gentlemen went through sort of the lineage and the background of what previous configurations of different flavors of this organization kind of look like. So that, so that was sort of yesterday, talked a little bit about today. The force design project is looking at tomorrow. So can you explain to us about what the MIG's relationship to force design is as we look forward to that tomorrow?
So, yeah. Brian, you want to go first on this one, or you want me to jump in on it?
Go for it. You got it.
So I'll just quickly highlight there's a challenge here, and I think it's important to remember the near history. The MIG was a product of the Marine Corps Operating Concept 2025. And so that came out circa 2016, 2017. And then the MIG was very nascent when the current Commandant released his force design guidance. I think because it hadn't really proven itself, it is certainly not a prominent vestige inside Force Design 2030. However, I would then pause and say, as the service experiments with the ideas behind force design, what I am finding out here, as III MEF, for example, works to becoming a viable stand-in force, is we're essentially coming in the side or the back of force design because of all the capabilities Brian and I have talked about before, and what the Commandant describes as the changing character of war. So there's an irony here. We're not a product of force design, but in many ways we're rapidly becoming one. And there's an attention there as well that both Brian and I are dealing with the institution as to how do we best manifest that while the service is doing all the other changes. Brian, I don't know if you wanted to jump off from there.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to pick up on the experimentation angle a little bit, and I know the II MEF perspective is absolutely within our own AOR. We are USU comm aligned, have a lot of rotational forces there. We are trying each and every day to apply some of those concepts in real time and often in live environments to bear them out. II MEF is the lead for the service on experimenting with reconnaissance and counter reconnaissance. We actually have a force overseas in USUCOM working for 6th Fleet right now, doing a lot of experimentation. So I think a lot about what does cyberspace reconnaissance and space reconnaissance mean for the Fleet Marine Force. I've got an idea of what that is, given my time at the U.S. Cyber Command, but I think Ray and I both understand that we both are probably the leading edge of having the organic capabilities in those domains for the MEF, so probably up to us to figure out what that means, not only for the Fleet Marine Force, but the service. And just by way of example and visualizing this, again, it's combined arms. You use the tools you have. No one's really waiting for the next thing. We have mission each and every day. But even my defensive cyber company is a bit of a reconnaissance force as we lay out our network terrain and determine what's critical from a reverse targeting methodology. Certainly, malicious cyber actors are coming after our kill chains. So we draw essentially named areas of interest around those critical nodes, and that's where we apply our resource with essentially what I call the electronic version of binoculars to look and confirm that adversary presence so we can do something about it. That, to me, is a form of cyber reconnaissance that we're experimenting here in II MEF. So I think that's what I think about in terms of force design. We might talk a little bit later after Ray talks about stand-in force and his main mission, how we view that here in II MEF and try and implement that concept. Over.
Great, thanks, sir. Colonel Gerber, do you have anything to add before we move on to the next point?
No, Ian, I think it actually segues into the next point about how is the Pacific Postured MEF, aka III MEF, employing its MIG. And so I kind of go back to a question that we get asked a lot. Are you a force provider or a unit of action? And the answer is yes. Some of the ways that we fulfill the mission that we provide for this MEF, which I kind of break down really quickly into, we can assure your command and control. We provision you with intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance in order to generate effects. Sometimes that's by creating man, train, and equipped detachments or enablers that are provided at the appropriate echelon, usually more importantly at the appropriate place in order to achieve that. But increasingly, there's also facets of it. For example, the MIG is the only place in the MEF that really does space and cyber. And so as a unit of action in that, those domains were often employed in that fashion. The other thing I'd highlight, as Brian alluded to, is III MEF works towards becoming a stand-in force, as described by the Commandant and recently by the ACMAC in proceedings, for example, to become a small survivable force that can operate with a low signature and what have you. We have to echelon our capabilities. And so I support the MEF commander. The MSB fights the MEF CP. Those are not necessarily the same thing. I've turned my battalions into small composite battalions that can support the major subordinate commands, or even at the company level, we can form a composite company to support regiments as required. Because of the specific area of the world that we focus on, and being about 400 miles from the primary pacing threats, appropriate theater command, for example, the Eastern Theater of the Chinese Navy, or the Chinese, we're at a constant ISR soak. And so we feel that we're in contact every day in competition. And thus, we have to be prepared to segue from that through crisis into a potential conflict very quickly. That forces me into an arena where I do the things that Brian talks about, but my primary focus as a MIG commander, while assuring command and control and provisioning ISR, is to do counter ISRT against that adversary. It's one thing to be able to do it for yourself, but the real value proposition that we're finding that we bring to bear is finding ways to stop an adversary from doing that to you, particularly when that adversary relies upon the concept of information dominance, to render what it calls effective control. And so that's where we spend most of the time dwelling out here. That is not the same as what Brian is necessarily doing as a global response service retained MIG. Over.
Great, thanks, sir. I think with good transitions, that's a great transition over to Colonel Russell to talk about the globally responsive MEF. And sir, with that, if maybe you could help define for the audience first, if they're not familiar, what globally responsive means, and then how you're employed inside of that mission set.
Yeah, appreciate that. As I mentioned before, principally U.S. EUCOM focused, principally Russia focused, have rotational forces there, but we are the services service retained force. So if there is unanticipated crisis or contingency, that mission is likely coming down to II MEF to go help take care of. And we've got some recent experience of that, whether it was the evacuation out of Afghanistan, humanitarian assistance, disaster relief in Haiti, even some of the current contingency operations going on, needing forces to solve that. Those asks, so to speak, come down to II MEF. Where I'm similar to III MIG and Colonel Gerber gets back to this aspect of task organization. He has a good construct at higher echelons within a maritime warfighting construct, but the approach is similar, providing task organized MIG detachments to a supportive force, whether that's internal to II MEF or allies, partners, or even the naval force. And I see one of the questions in chat about how we're presenting ourselves to the joint force. I've even experimented and employed MIG detachments in support of national cutters from the U.S. Coast Guard. I put them on naval platforms operating in U.S. EUCOM AOR, somewhat independently from Marine forces, but they provide unique capabilities that those other forces don't have. And just from a globally kind of aware force, this is where it gets really interesting working across MIGs. Ray and I had the opportunity last year to support the HMS Queen Elizabeth's inaugural deployment around the world, Carrier Strike Group. We have a relationship with the UK and the commandos and their information exploitation group. I was able to embed, I'm going to go back to Anglico, liaison team, Ray's exactly right, in the UK to support that global deployment. We started in US EUCOM, did essentially a battlefield handover to Colonel Gerber and III MIG to paint their awareness of what to expect in the Indo-PACOM AOR and support their information advantage. So we do present ourselves as a task organized capability outside of the Marine Corps for several missions. And let me just, one more aspect of globally responsive from a II MEF perspective. We have realized that a lot of our doctrine says when we go to war, quote unquote, we establish our centers to operate at the MEF level, the Intel Operations Center, the Fires and Effects Center, the Comm Center, and the like. We are running those all the time. They are always established, and they're always looking at the place the CG tells us to look at or where we think we might go, and that includes this new combined Fires and Effects Coordination Center and my ICC. We have put those two entities together to kind of knock down the kinetic and non-kinetic stovepipes. Because again, this is all 21st century combined arms. We just realized when we get the call and we don't know where we're going, we've got to be ready to go. So we've established standing centers to be able to support that. Over.
Thanks, sir. And again, with the segues, this kind of leads good well into the next item, which was, as you both mentioned, there's some commonalities in terms of being a tailor organized organization, but there are some differences between your respective groups. And so if you could talk a little bit about how do we reconcile these differences between these MSCs from MEF to MEF, or do we even have to?
So I think the institution has to a degree in order for it to provide organized, trained, and equipped entities out to the fleet for utilization. So there's a commonality in training pipelines, for example, or in certain equipping fieldings that we have to maintain for economy of scale and the ability to have standards at a basic level and even at an advanced level. Beyond that, however, I think one of the things that we consistently run up against is the institutional desire to do that in terms of actual tactical application. And if you look at things like, I'm not sure if it's published yet, but I think most people are tracking that the Commandant's already said MEFs don't need to be mirrored. The annual report that's forthcoming that talks about force design's progress will explicitly give guidance to the different MEFs to perform different functions. We've alluded to that already in here. my MEF, III MEF, is turning into a stand-in force as defined by the service as a component of joint stand-in forces. Brian's is a globally responsive force. And so those two MEFs are going to do different things in different ways for different people. And thus, at a point, you very quickly diverge and say the differences are actually okay. And not only they're okay, they're actually desired. And I'll pause there, Brian, in case you wanted to jump in.
Yeah, I do. I certainly think commonality is good in some sense. We all will deploy together certain AORs. We've talked a lot about what does a MIG UDP rotation look like out the AOR rank, right? Not just battalions and squadrons, but capabilities from this coast out there. I guess, you know, I don't think we need to be different. We definitely have different mission sets. We've talked the kind of immediate response needs of II MEF, but I'll tell you, even within our maritime warfighting construct, we're a little bit different. I call it the fight across and within the Atlantic. We work with two fleets out here on the East Coast, 2nd and 6th, and we're developing concepts of how we work with them. I did want to bring out the fact that a lot of the capabilities we plan for, coordinate, and or get the authorities and permissions to employ happen so much at the component level. And so I deal primarily with two different components in UCOM, the Marine one and the Naval one. But I'll tell you today now, II MEF has forces working for all components in US UCOM, with II MEF forces that are all looking to achieve some level of all-domain effect or recon, counter-recon approach. And that requires, I think, some answers from our service on the way ahead for componency. And again, to answer the question about how are we presenting ourselves to the joint force, I have had conversations with the US UCOM J39, who understands a MIG capability, and wouldn't it be great to employ it as an information warfare task force in the current construct that they're dealing with over there. So yeah, a lot of opportunity, but again, I don't think we need to be mirror imaged across all the MIGs and MIGs.
Right, thanks, gentlemen. And actually, I'm gonna take that componency thought there and just hold on to it for a little bit, because we may have some folks online who have some questions or comments about that. But I'm going to circle back to something we hit on here right kind of at the start, which is some of the common misperceptions about the MIG. You know, going off of, you know, one, what is Anglico doing there, right? But there are doubtless some other ones out there. And gentlemen, you've already sort of touched on a couple. But if you could maybe expand a little bit on some of the differences between perception and reality.
So Ian, I already hit on one, but I'll come back to it. You know, and we've done ourselves no favors, and yet that's not born from malice. We have a lot of nascent concepts and sort of pre-doctrine that talks about information, and out of necessity, there's a tension there about information consuming. For example, intelligence and command and control is to become one warfighting function to eat them all and what have you. What we tend to fall back to, you know, as a misconception about this is the MIG has to do all 7 warfighting functions. And if you're not conversant in the vernacular of all of them, then you're probably not what is a quote unquote and yet undefined MAGTF officer. What I need to be able to field to the subordinate units or up to my MEF commander is competent MAGTF officers that can speak across all 7 of those. The other thing is, I've already alluded to, is frequently, depending particularly from certain functional areas, there's this idea that you're just a force provider. And I think that is something that people were comfortable with. It's born from the legacy of the SHRIG turning into the MHG and the MHG's legacy throughout the GWAT. And all I'll say on that is what I have found frequently is when the MEF commander looks around and he's got a choice between a functional area, for example, a staff section, or a commander that he can simply give a task, purpose, and end state, who then has authorities and resources to go out and achieve objectives. We're finding that there's a lot of power in having somebody in command of those forces that can task organize and generate tempo against it. Brian, I know you've got a version of this as well from your experience. I'd be interested in hearing about that.
Yeah, I think maybe I agree with everything Ray is saying about being units of action, not just a provision of force. And it's only about the information warfighting function across all of them in so many realms. I think there's also a misperception that we solve the MAGTF's OIE problem, or we are the solution to all domain operations or effects. And while we bring great capabilities and a certain level of expertise, I think there is growth that's required from a training education perspective for all of our officers and Marines to fight all domain or to apply information as a warfighting function. And so it's not, you don't bolt on the MIG and all of a sudden you're doing good at OIE. It requires planners that have a construct, commanders that give intent to plan around that construct for the effects they want to achieve. And again, the MIG will provide great capabilities to help them do that. And I think I saw MAGTF Trav there on the questions about the construct, 7 functions and 6 capability areas. And I've been a good soldier, and I've moved out and tried to apply those as best I can. And I find them helpful from a construct for, again, commanders and planners to visualize the battle space and apply capabilities to achieve effects. But it just seems to be a lot for me. 7 functions to deal with. Early in our history, we're taught to think in threes and employ in threes. And so I like the Navy's information warfare construct, assured C2, integrated fires, assured C2, integrated fires, and battle space awareness. That's a threes. Interesting MCDB8, information advantages in threes, like I mentioned. But whether it's all domain, 5 domains, or those constructs, just have a construct and apply that. That's what planners, staffs, commanders need to be thinking about for this future fight.
Great, thank you, sir. And yeah, just real quick to the audience, keep the questions coming in. We have a bunch here, and I want to make sure everyone gets a chance to ask what they'd like to our 2 guests today. But right before we get to that, one last point that we're going to talk on in sort of the prepared remarks, and then we'll get to the questions, and that's what is the potential of the MIG as we look forward, both as individuals and commanders, and then sort of as the Marine Corps institution as a whole.
So Ian, I teed this up because it's something that's near and dear to me, because right now the service is on the cusp of providing significant value to the joint force. We already do. Brian's alluded to that. We do very similar things out here in III MIG in terms of working often for multiple components in Indo-PACOM to provide them with capabilities, mostly because of our geographic, the primacy of real estate being west of the international date line. And there's a lot of utility in that. I alluded to it before that in places like space and cyber, you have to tie into the strategic and operational level in order to be able to leverage authorities and permissions, as well as understand the effects. PP&O last week, Strategy and Policy, put out a strategic link newsletter that talked about effects and fires. And I think one of the things that I'd pull from that we found to be true here is the future character of war against a peer threat demands that you respect them the same way that they respect us. And what that has driven us towards, and Brian's experienced a version of this with Russia, and we're definitely experiencing with the PRC, is that in order for you to be tactically successful, you have to be aware of strategic and operational level effects, usually non-lethal, that shape the environment to allow your tactical action to occur. I would say that the Marine Corps is struggling with this, because we have grown up in a world where the tactical action is the thing that everything centers around. And so you'll get questions and exercises and what have you about, can you move this effect to the left or to the right? Because I'd like to do my L hour at this time frame. And you kind of laugh and you're like, well, the president's not going to change when he decided to do this. And it might take several hours for it to go into motion. So no, I don't think we're going to move that. I think you're just going to have to decide whether or not you want to take the risk outside of that window, or you want to achieve your objective with a little bit more cover. What's ironic about this is none of this is fundamentally any different than the thing that Brian and I started with, talking about it's just combined arms. It's just combined arms in new ways with new technologies across the continuum, where sometimes it's about combat, oftentimes it's about signaling or messaging against threats. The potential of the MIG is it's ground zero in the MEF for achieving this. But as Brian alluded, it's not the only place in the MEF that has to do this. It's just a place that's got a lot of density of capability sets. And so the potential of the Marine Corps is realizing this. The challenge is realizing that it's not just the MIG that has to do this. And I'd be remiss if I didn't say we ironically come back to it's just about warfighting. And so, what's the MIG's potential? Assisting Marine entities and the joint force to achieve that warfighting philosophy that seeks to shatter the enemy's cohesion through a variety of rapid, focused, and unexpected actions, which create a turbulent and rapidly deteriorating situation with which the enemy cannot cope. The cognitive impact of information right there, often being applied with violence. And I'll stop there because I think we got some great questions, Brian, unless you want to jump in on any of that.
I got one perspective when you talk potential, and I'll come back to this stand-in force concept, which you certainly are out there. But some days I come into this building and realize that we're some form of a cognitive and technical stand-in force right here from Camp Lejeune, North Carolina. What I would mean by that, I've got Marines in this building right now supporting operations in the U.S.-UCOM AOR, supporting the conflict in the U.S.-UCOM AOR from either analysis or capability provision perspective. I think that is a growth industry. CONUS-based operational support, USOCOM has moved out on that, and this MIG has those capabilities to do that. I don't need to deploy forward to provide the operational value. I can do that from home station or other locations that aren't necessarily quote unquote in the conflict zone. That's what this modern information environment enables us to do. And I think that is just again, a growth industry for us as MIG information groups. Over.
All right. Thank you very much, sir and gentlemen. And with that, unless there's any last things you want to get to about potential, I think we covered that pretty well. I want to make sure we get to the questions here because we do have a bunch, and I want to maximize our time. So first off, I think one of you touched on already, but from Lieutenant Colonel Travis Horror, he's asking about Chapter 5 of the tentative manual for expeditionary advanced base operations was solely dedicated to operations in the information environment and how to operationalize the 7 functional and 6 capability areas of OIE from the MIG perspective. Do you think that that chapter hit the mark, and what might change or need to change to assist in the experimentation efforts under Force Design 23?
So I'll jump in. We have used TMEABO a great deal out here to help organize our thoughts on how do you take the information warfighting function as expressed by 7 functions, 6 capability areas, and operationalize it. And I think that manual did a decent job, a very good job, in fact, for where it was and when it was written at explaining that in layperson language. The biggest challenge with it, in my opinion, is the potential for it to pigeonhole the MIG solely into OIE. And so ironically, you have to be able to then say the preceding chapter, I believe, about intelligence is also a MIG function. And you have to get to the effects that all of this is designed to achieve. And so it's great. We have noticed the main challenges with adopting TMEABO out here lie more with it tends to benchmark in CWC, whereas many Marines, for a variety of reasons, tends to prefer JWAS, not realizing that JWAS has CWC. And I know there's plenty of people on the net right now, like Travis, Blake, et cetera, that can wax philosophic about all of this. So I'll just say it was good, very good. We've used it. It could improve, but it mostly can improve in how it ties into other warfighting functions. And I'll just stop there.
Yeah, agree with that. This is all about across the warfighting functions, and maybe we can even talk about intelligence support to OIE or all domain effects and some of the challenges there. So, Travis, it's a good starting point, and General Henderson's here, so he asks me quite often how we're applying the approaches and the principles. And back in my previous comment, we even do that from the Fusion Center in Camp Lejeune, North Carolina, even within exercise constructs. I think one of the challenges that I find is creating an environment to experiment within that is robust enough to bear out that the experiment worked in some sense. I think we have a long way to go as a service to build robust all-domain environments for us to experiment inside of, and this is where it gets tough, I think, for me and Ray when we're supporting a commander. They want to see the value. They put that analytical work in, they've had their staff crash on the problem, develop a framework, implement approaches for this all-domain fight, and then they're in a training environment and they're not seeing the tangible results for putting all that effort in. I think that we still have some work to do there. Over.
It's a segue, but that's an important one for the audience to make a distinction about. Particularly intelligence and information warfighting functions lack the ability, they're often the training aid for, not the end state of exercises and deployments for training and what have you. And then the other thing about this is because of the paucity of resources, most of the time we're live. And so the training to then get you into a place where you're in contact with an adversary, regardless of where you're on the continuum, means that we're not getting a chance to show supported commanders in certain echelons why they have to abide by some of the realities that we're bringing to bear. It's a challenge. And that's one of the things that we struggle to overcome, like Brian was alluding to. I felt like that was a point worth honing back in on and trying to amplify.
Yeah, I think so, Ray. Let me just, boy, this is going to be dangerous. You're going to have an artillery officer talking intelligence with another intelligence officer in command of the MIG. But to the point of the importance of intelligence for this all-domain fight, that is a two-way street. The planners, the operators have to be asking the right questions of the intelligence community or the intelligence system to go find those answers, to plan for this, and vice versa. The intel folks have to be probably better trained and educated in kind of what to look for in these other domains or the other approaches. And I know, Ray, you want me to bring up another OIE truth, but humans are in fact more important than hardware. It was just my way of saying we're very good at the technical targeting aspects. Let's geolocate, let's blow up a thing, but this is systems behavior, and so the human side of those things is very important as well. So not only do I need sometimes the technical traffic of what that adversary system is using to communicate, but sometimes knowing what they're communicating about is very, very important to influence them. I need to know where the friction points are inside that system, both technically and cognitively, to affect it. And so the planners have got to be asking the intel folks the right questions to frame out the PIRs so you get the answers to actually do this effectively. And
ironically, the intel folks have to be providing with prescriptive solutions to that. So they have to speak in the vernacular of the commander and of the commander's operational or fires and effects associated folks to then say the P sub K that you're attempting to achieve here is not likely to happen. But here's a better way to do this. To your point, Brian, about maybe we can go after this cognitively and achieve the same effect, albeit potentially with less confidence. And so the irony here is he's talking about intel and you've got an intel guy talking about effects. I think that's a welcome, to the MIG reality right now. And we'll pause, Ian, because I know you got more questions.
Yeah, actually, that's a great jumping off point to another question I have here. It was a private one, so it's not in the general chat, but the question was from Blake Johnson, and he's asking about the relationship specifically between Colonel Russell and your CG in your role as an effects coordinator, backfires and effects. Backfires and effects coordinator, and the MSC commander. Is that a role similar to the artillery CO as the fire support coordinator for the maneuver commander? Is that the optimal relationship and FEC/ICC configuration?
So that is both what I and General Journey are familiar with, that artillery model, where as a subordinate commander to a general officer headquarters, I bring up a capability and some expertise and help him coordinate things. And I think that's an applicable model for sure. The part of the FEC and ICC integration is mainly just to break down some of the stovepipes that exist. I do bring more quote unquote non-kinetic expertise to the fight, and FEC brings a little more kinetic expertise to the fight. So simply by co-locating those two entities, we're breaking down some stovepipes and educating both sides on how to do this all-domain fight. That's really the approach we're taking here. And I just take it one step further. As the effects coordinator and the MIG commander, I do see across the warfighting functions and how those warfighting functions can also produce effects when appropriately planned for. And so having good processes and relationships with my G2 and G6, who are key quote unquote warfighters in this fight of ours, is absolutely valuable. I've got a little bit better insight into how the MEFCG is thinking, more regular touch points with him and the key staff up there to produce the effects he's looking for. And I'll pause there if there's any follow-ups or Ray has perspectives on. I think you're thinking similarly out there, Ray.
I would just say that we're similar. We're not as evolved as you are, but our construct is different. The notion of a stand-in force requires distribution across the battle space, and that challenges some of the efficiencies you can gain. And so General Bierman has a similar analog. He's moving in a similar direction. I don't want to be pre-decisional about some of the things that he's thinking about doing that II MEF has already done. The only challenge that I've thrown out internally, and it somewhat undermines my own capability for the argument that you've so successfully done, is somebody has to wage a counter ISRT campaign on behalf of this MEF in what is essentially temporally the deep space, as well as the domains like space and cyber. And thus, that role tends to fall to us, and there's going to be a challenge of capacity. If you think about whether the MEF and what it wants to do in terms of effects, we find that it's very good to spread load that across MSCs and MSEs, given the multitude of roles that the MEF has to play out here, even while standing in. Over.
All right, thank you, gentlemen, both. I want to kind of bundle together a few questions here because there's been several that are sort of touching on the joint force aspects, and then to Jeremiah Root, I'm going to do your question after that. I just want to. There's a bunch here that I want to. I think we can put together. So some questions from both Eric Wallace and we got Tyler Quinn in here, as well. So asking, how is the Marine Corps presenting the MIGs to the Joint Force? It seems like the MIGs are information unit of action to enable info advantage. And if this is not the case, what's missing at the Joint Force level? And then Tyler was tying on to that is looking at the creation of the Combined Effects Center, and then how that idea fills into potential gaps or needs of the Joint Force.
So Brian, I know you've got deep experience with your components that you've talked to already here. I haven't alluded to it as much in mine, but it doesn't mean that it's not there. And that ties to the question about how do we present ourselves to the Joint Force? Here's the reality. You present yourself in the language that the customer understands. So if I'm talking to the PAC fleet N2, N39, for example, we talk about information warfare. If I'm talking to the JFAC non-kinetic effects, aspects out of the A3 to A39 at the Air Force in Hawaii, we'll talk about it in terms of the specific lanes that they're playing on behalf of the Joint Force tied back to the ATO. A long way of saying that you have to adopt yourself to the vernacular of the customer that you're working with or the authorities you're trying to leverage, which is really what we find we have to go to the operational level to best get employed on behalf of our MEF commander and the stand-in force concept that's happening out here. A final thought on that is what do we provide to the Joint Force is based off the primacy of real estate and the proximity that we provide to the adversary. That matters. I think there's a lot of desire at times to wage war from DC, but orbitology is still a thing, proximity is still a thing, and denied and degraded communications environments are going to be a reality. And so not all of this is going to be able to happen from a keyboard someplace in the DC area. That challenge, coupled with the fact that our doctrine right now, we've already talked about how service doctrine is nascent, joint doctrine is just as nascent. And so what I have consistently found is you have to send exceptionally competent people to higher headquarters where authorities lie. They have to demonstrate that competence in order to build confidence. And with confidence comes authorities and permissions and employment. And so that's where the Joint Force as a whole is at the moment, in my opinion. And I don't say that pejoratively because we're all working through this together.
From my perspective, I think the Joint Force is accustomed to the previous model of asking for a specific capability out of the MEF information group. And we spend a lot of our times training and educating that, yes, you're asking for this one thing, but what if I provided you this task organized capability? Perhaps you don't just need a CI Marine, but perhaps he's enabled with a cyber capability to do something else. That's the discussion I have a lot with any component per se that we work with. Again, it's back to that aspect of why the MIGs are created, I believe. The task organization, the ability to bring capabilities together is really what the value is. And we'll talk as part of the Joint Force Cyber Command. We do spend a lot of time thinking about what the future of cyberspace requirements are here in the Fleet Marine Force. With Ray and I have capabilities to do that. The approach we've taken generally is to train to their standards. So my DCU-IDM company is essentially interoperable with a cyber protection team out of US Cybercom, and that opens some doors to you. That lets you work on other people's networks or with allies and partners who trust you because you're trained to a certain standard. And I think we'll approach it the same way from an offensive cyber perspective. We build out that capability in the FMF, abiding by that US Cybercom standard. So US Cybercom, All4 Cyber, aware of the capabilities we have. We talk a lot with them about either being enabled by or enabling them in the cyberspace domain. Over.
So I think, Brian, the comment that you made can't be, highlighted enough. It's about training to the appropriate standard that's going to get you employed. And often that's naval or joint or naval and joint. And that applies in cyber, it applies in space, it applies in the electromagnetic spectrum, it applies in psychological operations, military deception. You name any of the things, OIE or beyond, that the Marine Corps has to do, that the MIG brings to bear. And it's, are you trained at a standard that somebody else recognizes and therefore will employ you? And that sometimes can be a struggle when the service wants to retain its own identity and have its own way of doing business. The reality is as a member of the Joint Force, you have to be training to the overarching standard.
Great, thank you, gentlemen. Looking at the clock, I do want to try and get through some more questions here. So we'll try and do this expeditiously. So next one, like I said, from Jeremiah Root is, gentlemen, what is your opinion of the newly proposed Marine Corps Information Command as a third hat under the Cyber and Space Commanding General? And then how will this impact or enhance the MIGs and MCIOC?
So I'll go first. It might turn into a third rail for me. So Brian is bravely waiting for me to answer. As a service retained Echelon 2 functional headquarters, I think the key for it is going to be straddling the predisposition of doing things itself versus doing things for assigned and allocated units that work for a geographic combatant commander. That's a lot of buzzwords, but I think a lot of the audience understands exactly the tension that I'm describing here. I go back to there's places on Earth where things happen and Marines manning equipment may not be coming from that command, but they have to leverage those authorities. I think that the MCIC has the potential to bring that to bear in the same way that the Army, the 10th Fleet for the Navy does for them, et cetera. But there's going to be some institutional tension with that until we work out exactly how that works. I believe that's a fair representation of 3MF's opinion, 3 MIG's opinion on the matter, which is it has significant potential, but it also has to find a way to straddle between service retained as well as assigned and allocated.
So I guess it's my turn, and I'm gonna start by asking a question back. Is what is the role of the service headquarters to generate effects or influence? That's an interesting question. We do in various realms and capacities, but what's the process and organization serves to do that more effectively? So I understand service intent for force design capabilities that should be revealed or not that are being developed. There's some room for improvement there, and a Marine Corps Information Command might improve that. But what we've shared from the 2MEF perspective is twofold. Back to one of the comments I see here in the chat, it is important to put the right people in the right places to get access to authorities or capabilities and the like. So if the construct of that is doing that, putting the right people in the right places that I can leverage, fantastic. And then certainly from our crisis response role, if I am going to a place I haven't been thinking about and that command would better enable me to come up on plane very quickly, all about it. But back to Colonel Gerber's point, what is the expectation of a service training organization to provide dedicated support to a MEF or a MEF information group? Because success in these realms requires some dedicated focus and understanding of the environment. So that's my opinion on the proposed info command. Over.
Great, thank you, gentlemen. And we're at about an hour. I just want to check with both of you. Do you have time for one more question potentially?
Time here.
I'm good until the movers show up.
Okay, sir. When we hear grinding truck noises, then I guess we'll know we're done. So the next question here from Travis Reese asking if you gentlemen can discuss how the various threats leverage and lead with information, both narrative and technical, to set conditions for actions above and below the threshold of armed conflict. And then how should the Marine Corps and Naval Force think in terms of order of battle when it comes to addressing that aspect of adversary action?
You would have to end with Travis. That's wonderful. As a battle buddy of mine, since we were in the last amphibious warfare school conference group together, I knew that was the one that I was hoping we'd avoid because it's an exceptional question. It's very difficult to answer. And I could throw out and it's very difficult to answer at this classification level, all of which is meaningless. And so I think you first and foremost have to understand what he explicitly meant. And there's a gap there. What I mean by that is the Marine Corps hasn't spent the time, I would say, to have the depth of understanding about what he means when he says a threat, be it, for example, Russia or China, and leveraging information or technical aspects to achieve advantage. So first, you have to deeply understand your threat from their perspective, understanding what the Chinese mean when they say information dominance, for example, in a layperson terms. That means assuring their command and control, provisioning their ISR so that they have a mathematically computatable threshold for achieving their effects across the continuum. To go to one of the other questions, is it related to how do they use political warfare, United Front work activity, and those kinds of things? You have to understand that at a high degree of depth to then put into the planning process. What is a military capability across the dime spectrum? In what domain in order to achieve what effect, in particular in the midst of campaigning? And so there's a lot of challenges here. As an intelligence officer, I start with first, you have to understand the threat in order to understand how you're going to achieve anything against it. And then the other thing that we've seen that's a challenge here is doing so with a campaigning mindset. Too often we do an operation activity and investment in OAI for the sake of the measure of effect is the measure of performance. I think that's insufficient, particularly when you go up against a peer. And so we have to mature against this in the same way that we have an affinity or a nostalgia for how we supposedly did it against the Soviets. I'm not convinced that that's as true as we say it is, but it's going to need to be true against China or in the long-term threat Russia is going to have as it persists in what it's, mired down within the Ukraine. Brian, your chance to avoid Travis's question as good as I did.
So we are a far cry from Field Artillery Officer Basic Course, Travis. Yes, indeed. But I'll address this one because I agree with everything Colonel Gerber said. How do we know it matters? In terms of the difficulty I find is assessing our effectiveness or even the adversary's effectiveness in some of these domains or some of these realms. And that goes back. It comes out in campaigning, it comes out in planning, just like Colonel Gerber said. But what does that collection plan look like to know whether I'm making a difference or not? If I do have a capability that could be applied within the appropriate escalation framework for the component I'm working for, the command I'm working for, to show that it will make a difference. And that's where I think we're challenged in some of these realms to determine whether it would matter or not, whether I should do anything or not about those other informational approaches the adversary takes.
All right, great, gentlemen. Thank you both very much. And I now know that the Travis Reese questions are like the gold standard for the broadcast here. So I'll keep that in mind for future episodes and how to sequence those in as they come. So with that, I'm to everyone else, I appreciate your patience. I'm gonna have to cut off the questions here because we are crossing a lot of time zones here and folks have places to be. But gentlemen, I'll give you a few seconds here at the end here if you want to have any final comments.
I just want to say thank you for the time. I appreciate the chance to air this out and have an audience like yours take a look at it and ask the hard questions. I would say this doesn't end the dialogue. Since you're going to be able to hang this, if people have questions down the road, I would offer reach out at any time. I'm not as good at writing as Colonel Russell is, but I'm coming up with my own article ideas to riff off of his truths. And Brian, I would be remiss if I didn't say it's been a fun ride having a battle buddy like you in an adjacent flank. I would not want to do it with anybody else. And so thank you for your time this morning from Okinawa.
Yeah, I'll bridge off of that. As I mentioned before, Colonel Gerber and I have done these repeatedly, and Ray, it's always great with you. And I think part of the reason that is both you and I have this wonderful, blessed opportunity to lead just brilliant Marines that are figuring things out in this space. So he and I simply just get this opportunity to share that with you. Everything they're figuring out, experimentation, applying new concepts, figuring out 21st century combined arms. It's been an absolute blessing for me as we both wrap up our command time here. Happy to share this with everyone, and same offer. If you got some questions, go ahead and reach out. Happy to give you some feedback after the cast. And thanks again. Appreciate it.
Yeah, great. Thank you both, gentlemen. And kind of on that note to the audience, as you can tell, we probably could have kept going here for another hour or so. If there wasn't a real world we had to get to, and but there has been some discussion about potentially doing some additional follow up here to sort of explore some deeper aspects of everything that was discussed. So just keep following us on our social media channels, or if you're on our email distribution list. Again, we got to synchronize multiple time zones, but if we can do some follow-on episodes here, I definitely think we have tons of good insights that we can share with a wider audience. So to everyone, to our two guests, gentlemen, thank you again very much for your time and flexibility and troubleshooting and all that stuff. To our audience, thanks for joining us here at a sort of slightly later hour than we usually do. But it's been great that we've been able to pull in pretty good audiences here, even though I've started scheduling these things at all crazy hours of the day. So thank you very much for that. And I'll do a couple shout outs here to some things that we do have coming up. Tomorrow, we have Middle East Studies presenting the next research talk with Dr. David Mallett of American University. And he's going to tie in nicely to our focus on the war in Ukraine with a discussion on what to expect when you're a foreign fighter in Ukraine. And then on Friday, we'll be back to the broadcast with Dr. Marcus Goranson of Swedish Defense University, who's going to be talking to us about Russian military thinking, new war, and the strategy of limited actions. And I'll make a last plug. It was noted out there on Twitter, I think, by Travis Reese as well. I was able to capture another down the rabbit hole on the Russia-Ukraine war here with Dr. Yuval Weber, our resident Russia SME. It's already out. It was out there for the evening commute. So if you haven't listened to it or watched it yet, we take a look at what might happen, what victory is going to look like on Victory Day on May 9th. Take a look at developments in Transnistria, and then the latest on EU sanctions against Russia. So lots of content coming your way. Please enjoy. And again, thank you all for your time tonight.
Education is what's important. Training, preparation for the expected. Education, preparation for the unexpected.